The morning of August 7, 1942, arrived with deceptive tranquility over the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Goetsch peered through his field glasses at the jungle-shrouded coastline of Guadalcanal, where Japanese forces had been constructing what intelligence reports described as a crucial airfield. The humid air carried the scent of tropical vegetation and the distant sound of exotic birds. But beneath this serene facade lay the seeds of what would become one of the most pivotal campaigns of World War II. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's amphibious task force had approached under cover of darkness. 19,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division prepared for what they believed would be a swift operation. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift stood on the command ship's bridge, studying the intelligence reports that painted an incomplete picture of Japanese strength on the island. The morning sun cast long shadows across the water as landing craft began their approach to the beaches designated red and blue. The initial landings at Lunga Point proceeded with surprising ease. Marines of the 5th Regiment waded ashore expecting fierce resistance, but found only scattered Japanese construction workers and a few surprised sentries. The absence of significant opposition created an atmosphere of cautious optimism among the assault forces. By midday, advance patrols had reached the partially completed airfield, which would soon bear the name Henderson Field in honor of a Marine pilot killed at Midway. However, the apparent success of the landings masked a more complex strategic situation. Japanese forces under Colonel Kiyotake Kawaguchi had withdrawn into the dense jungle interior, following established doctrine to avoid beach defenses in favor of inland positions. The tropical terrain of Guadalcanal presented challenges that no amount of training could fully prepare the Marines for: oppressive heat, torrential rains, and vegetation so thick that visibility often extended only a few yards. As the 1st Marine Division consolidated its beachhead, reports began filtering in from other landing sites. The assault on nearby Tulagi had encountered fierce resistance from Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, who fought with the fanatical determination that would characterize much of the Pacific War. The small island's caves and bunkers had to be cleared one by one, each position defended to the last man. The strategic importance of Guadalcanal extended far beyond its immediate tactical value. Control of the airfield would determine whether Japanese or Allied forces could dominate the sea lanes to Australia. Emperor Hirohito's military advisors had identified the Solomon Islands as crucial to maintaining Japan's defensive perimeter, while American planners recognized that stopping Japanese expansion required seizing the initiative in the Pacific. By evening of that first day, Marine engineers were already assessing the captured airfield's potential. The Japanese had completed much of the runway construction, inadvertently providing the Americans with a strategic asset that would prove decisive in the months ahead. As darkness fell over Guadalcanal, both sides began to comprehend the true magnitude of the struggle that lay ahead. The island's jungle seemed to pulse with unseen menace as Marines established their first perimeter. They had achieved their initial objectives, but survival in this hostile environment would demand resources, determination, and sacrifices that few could yet imagine. The campaign for Guadalcanal had begun, and with it, the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific theater. The thunderous roar of Japanese bombs shattered the pre-dawn silence of August 8, 1942. Marines dove for cover as Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force unleashed a devastating barrage. On the newly captured Henderson Field, the Battle of Savo Island had begun, and with it, the Japanese Navy's fierce determination to reclaim their lost airfield became brutally apparent. Captain Charles Fike of the Marine Corps' aviation unit surveyed the damage to the partially constructed runway as smoke cleared from the bombardment. Despite the destruction, Marine engineers continued their desperate race to complete the airfield before the next Japanese attack. The strategic value of Henderson Field had become the focal point of an increasingly violent struggle that would test both sides' resolve. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Raider Battalion had landed on Tulagi to find Japanese forces entrenched in caves and prepared positions. The fighting was close quarters and vicious, with Marines using flamethrowers and explosives to clear each Fortified position. The Japanese defenders, members of the 3rd Special Naval Landing Force, fought with a ferocity that shocked even veteran Marines. Every cave had to be sealed, every bunker destroyed, as the raiders learned that their enemy would accept no quarter and give none in return. As referenced in historical accounts from the Pacific War archives, the logistical challenges facing the Marines became apparent within days of the initial landing. Supply ships had withdrawn following the naval defeat at Savo Island, leaving Vandegrift's forces dangerously low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The tropical climate accelerated the spoilage of rations, while the constant threat of Japanese air attacks made resupply operations increasingly perilous. The Japanese response to the American landings was swift and coordinated. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayakitaka's 17th Army began moving reinforcements from Rabaul, while Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet prepared to support a major counteroffensive. The Japanese High Command viewed the loss of Guadalcanal as a temporary setback that could be quickly reversed through superior night fighting tactics and spiritual determination. Henderson Field became operational on August 20th when the 1st Marine fighters landed on the hastily repaired runway. Major John Lucian Smith's squadron of Wildcat fighters provided immediate relief to the beleaguered ground forces, but the airfield remained under constant threat from Japanese bombardment. The Marines nicknamed their precarious position Cactus, a code name that would become synonymous with desperate courage under impossible circumstances. The jungle warfare that characterized the Guadalcanal campaign differed fundamentally from the European theater. Visibility was limited to yards rather than miles, while the oppressive heat and humidity sapped the strength of men, already weakened by inadequate rations and tropical diseases. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever claimed as many casualties as Japanese bullets, creating a dual enemy that attacked from within and without. Night brought particular terror to the Marines defending Henderson Field. Japanese infiltration tactics exploited the darkness and dense vegetation, creating an atmosphere of constant tension where every shadow might conceal an enemy soldier. The distinctive sound of Japanese aircraft approaching became known as Washing Machine Charlie, a psychological warfare tactic designed to deny the defenders rest and maintain constant pressure on their nerves. Colonel Kawaguchi's forces had established positions in the jungle hills surrounding the airfield, preparing for a coordinated assault that would exploit Japanese superiority in night combat. The stage was set for a series of battles that would determine not only the fate of Guadalcanal, but the future course of the Pacific War itself. The night of September 13th, 1942, descended upon Henderson Field like a suffocating blanket. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson crouched behind a makeshift parapet on the ridge south of the airfield, listening to the jungle sounds that masked the approach of Colonel Kawaguchi's assault forces. The Marines had dubbed this defensive position Bloody Ridge, though they could not yet imagine how prophetic that name would prove to be. Kawaguchi's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. 3 columns of Japanese infantry would converge on Henderson Field from different directions, overwhelming the Marine defenders through coordinated night attacks. The Japanese commander had studied American defensive tactics and believed that surprise and superior night fighting skills would carry the day. His forces had been moving through the jungle for days, enduring the same tropical hardships that plagued their American opponents. The first probing attacks began at 2100 hours, as Japanese soldiers infiltrated the Marine perimeter. With ghostly silence, Private First Class Joseph Champagne of the 1st Raider Battalion fired at muzzle flashes in the darkness, unsure whether his shots had found their marks. The jungle amplified every sound: the crack of rifle fire, the explosion of grenades, the screams of wounded men from both sides. Major Kenneth Bailey's company held the center of the ridge, as waves of Japanese infantry charged up the steep slopes. The Marines had established interlocking fields of fire, but the darkness and dense vegetation made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along the defensive line, as Japanese soldiers broke through the wire barriers and engaged the raiders with bayonets and swords. The intensity of the fighting reached its peak near midnight, when Colonel Kawaguchi committed his reserve forces to a final assault on the airfield. Marine artillery, directed by Lieutenant Colonel Pedro del Valle, fired into the jungle at point-blank range, creating a wall of steel that broke the back of the Japanese attack. The thunder of the guns echoed across the island, while tracer rounds illuminated the battlefield in stark, deadly beauty as dawn approached. The true cost of the Battle of Bloody Ridge became apparent. Japanese bodies littered the approaches to the Marine positions, testament to the ferocity of their repeated assaults. Colonel Kawaguchi's forces had suffered devastating casualties. While failing to achieve their primary objective, the ridge remained in Marine hands, but at a terrible price in blood and ammunition. Captain William Hawkins surveyed the aftermath of the battle. As morning light revealed the full extent of the carnage, Marine casualties had been relatively light compared to their attackers, but every loss struck deeply in the small, tight-knit units that had been fighting together since the initial landings. The tropical heat would soon make burial of the dead an urgent necessity, adding another grim task to the Marines' already overwhelming responsibilities. The failure of the September offensive marked a turning point in Japanese strategy. The myth of invincibility that had sustained Japanese forces since Pearl Harbor began to crack under the reality of American defensive tenacity. Lieutenant General Hayakutaka's headquarters in Rabaul received increasingly desperate reports from Guadalcanal, describing an enemy that refused to break despite overwhelming odds. Henderson Field remained operational throughout the battle, its runway serving as a lifeline for Marine aviators who provided close air support to the ground forces. Major Robert Gaylor's fighter squadron had been reduced to fewer than a dozen operational aircraft, but these few planes proved decisive in breaking up Japanese troop concentrations and supply efforts. The Marines' victory at Bloody Ridge demonstrated that American forces could match Japanese night fighting capabilities when properly prepared and positioned. The psychological impact of this success resonated throughout the Pacific theater, providing Allied commanders with confidence that Japanese expansion could be halted and reversed through determined resistance. The eerie whistle of incoming naval shells split the darkness of October 13, 1942, as Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force unleashed another devastating bombardment on Henderson Field. Marines huddled in their foxholes while 14-inch shells from the battleships Congo and Haruna churned the coral runway into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. The Japanese had perfected their nighttime supply runs, which the Americans grimly nicknamed the Tokyo Express. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer's Cactus Air Force had been reduced to a handful of operational aircraft by the relentless Japanese bombardments. Each dawn brought frantic efforts to repair the runway and salvage damaged fighters, while ground crews worked under constant threat of renewed attacks. The Japanese timing was precise: bombardment by night, repair by day, with the cycle repeating until both sides approached the breaking point of human endurance. The logistics of warfare in the Solomon Islands had become a deadly chess game played across hundreds of miles of ocean. Japanese destroyers and cruisers raced down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, delivering supplies and reinforcements under cover of darkness. American submarines and aircraft attempted to intercept these runs, but the Japanese Navy's superior night fighting capabilities gave them a significant advantage in these encounters. Major General Alexander Vandegrift's forces had been reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment, but these Army troops were unprepared for the unique challenges of jungle warfare. The integration of Army and Marine units created tactical complications at a time when unity of command was essential for survival. Cultural differences between the services manifested in conflicting approaches to patrol tactics and defensive positioning, according to military historians' analysis of Pacific theater operations. The period from October through November 1942 represented the campaign's most critical phase. Both sides had committed substantial resources to the struggle, making retreat politically and strategically impossible. The Japanese had designated Guadalcanal as a decisive battle that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War, while American planners recognized that failure on the island would compromise the entire Allied strategy in the region. The Japanese reinforcement effort culminated in the arrival of Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama's 2nd Division, elite troops who had distinguished themselves in the conquest of the Dutch East Indies. These veteran soldiers brought with them heavy artillery and anti-aircraft guns that posed a new threat to Henderson Field's operations. The jungle paths that had served for previous reinforcements proved inadequate for moving this heavy equipment, forcing the Japanese to construct new supply routes under constant harassment from Marine patrols. Captain Joseph Foss's fighter squadron had achieved remarkable success despite overwhelming odds, shooting down numerous Japanese aircraft and earning the grudging respect of their opponents. The individual skill of American pilots began to compensate for their numerical disadvantage, as combat experience taught them to exploit the weaknesses of Japanese aircraft and tactics. The Wildcat fighters proved more durable than their Japanese counterparts, able to absorb punishment that would have destroyed a Zero. The physical condition of both armies deteriorated rapidly under the tropical climate, and constant combat stress, malaria, and dysentery weakened soldiers on both sides, while the humid environment accelerated the breakdown of equipment and supplies. Medical facilities were overwhelmed by the steady stream of casualties, forcing field commanders to make difficult decisions about evacuating wounded personnel. The strategic importance of Guadalcanal had expanded beyond its initial objectives. Control of the airfield now symbolized the broader struggle between Japanese expansion and American determination. News reports from the island reached the American public, creating emotional investment in the campaign's outcome that transcended military considerations. The Marines defending Henderson Field had become symbols of American resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. As October drew to a close, both sides prepared for what they believed would be the final, decisive battle for Guadalcanal. The Japanese were massing their largest force yet assembled for the campaign, while American reinforcements were en route from Australia and New Zealand. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of one jungle airfield, but the future direction of the Pacific War. The pre-dawn darkness of November 13th, 1942, erupted in a thunderous cacophony of naval gunfire as Admiral Hiroaki Abe's battleship force approached Henderson Field. The massive 16-inch guns of the battleship Hiei sent shells screaming toward the airfield, each explosion creating geysers of coral and earth that could be seen for miles. This was the opening salvo of what would become known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a 3-day engagement that would determine the campaign's ultimate outcome. Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan's cruiser force steamed directly into the Japanese formation, accepting devastating odds in a desperate attempt to prevent the systematic destruction of Henderson Field. The American ships were outgunned and outnumbered, but Callaghan understood that allowing the Japanese bombardment to continue would doom the Marine garrison to certain defeat. His famous order to commence firing launched one of the most chaotic naval battles in American history. The surface engagement that followed defied conventional naval tactics as ships from both sides became intermixed in the darkness. The heavy cruiser San Francisco exchanged point-blank fire with Japanese destroyers, while searchlights illuminated the battlefield in stark, deadly beauty. Admiral Callaghan and Admiral Norman Scott both died in the fierce fighting, their ships serving as funeral pyres for hundreds of American sailors who gave their lives to protect the Marines ashore. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's long-range patrol had been operating behind Japanese lines for weeks, gathering intelligence on enemy troop movements and supply routes. These reconnaissance missions provided crucial information about Japanese preparations for their final offensive, but the cost in casualties was severe. The jungle environment claimed as many raiders as enemy action, with malaria and infected wounds evacuating experienced soldiers faster than they could be replaced. The Japanese ground offensive began on November 14th, with Lieutenant General Tadayoshi Sano's forces launching coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The Sendai Division had been decimated by disease and malnutrition during their approach march, but the surviving soldiers retained their fanatical determination to recapture the airfield. Marine defenders, equally weakened by months of combat, and tropical diseases, prepared for what they believed would be their final stand. Major Joseph Saylor's artillery batteries fired continuously throughout the night, their shells guided by Marine forward observers who had infiltrated Japanese assembly areas. The jungle amplified the sound of the bombardment, creating a hellish symphony that could be heard across the entire island. Japanese soldiers advancing through the undergrowth faced a withering combination of artillery fire, machine gun positions, and carefully placed minefields. The turning point came when Japanese naval forces attempted to land reinforcements at Tassafaronga Point, only to encounter American cruisers and destroyers in a confused night battle. The Japanese had achieved tactical superiority in previous naval engagements, but their commanders' growing desperation led to increasingly reckless tactics. The loss of experienced naval officers in these battles degraded Japanese operational effectiveness at a critical moment. As dawn broke over Henderson Field on November 15th, the landscape revealed the full extent of the carnage. Japanese bodies littered the approaches to the Marine perimeter, while destroyed aircraft and burning fuel dumps sent columns of black smoke into the tropical sky. The airfield itself had been cratered by naval gunfire, but Marine engineers were already working to restore its operational capability. The psychological impact of the November battles extended far beyond Guadalcanal itself. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated with the belief that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantages, but the reality of American firepower and defensive tenacity shattered these illusions. Radio intercepts revealed growing demoralization among Japanese units, with some commanders reporting that their troops were no longer willing to mount suicidal attacks. The successful defense of Henderson Field during the November crisis marked the beginning of Japan's irreversible decline. In the Pacific, the myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, crumbled under the weight of American industrial capacity and military determination. The Marines holding their perimeter around the airfield had achieved more than tactical victory. They had demonstrated that the Japanese Empire could be defeated through sustained resistance and superior logistics. The morning of December 9, 1942, brought an unusual silence to the jungles surrounding Henderson Field. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps had relieved the exhausted 1st Marine Division, bringing fresh troops and abundant supplies to continue the offensive that would finally drive Japanese forces from Guadalcanal. The Marines who had held the perimeter for months were gaunt, diseased, and battle-weary, but they had accomplished something unprecedented in the Pacific War. They had stopped Japanese expansion cold. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutaka's headquarters in the jungle hills west of the airfield had become a scene of desperate improvisation. Japanese supply lines had been severed by American naval and air superiority, forcing the once-proud 17th Army to subsist on roots, tree, bark, and whatever provisions could be salvaged from destroyed supply dumps. The tropical diseases that had weakened both armies now ravaged Japanese forces with particular severity. As malnutrition reduced their resistance to malaria and dysentery, the American buildup on Guadalcanal had reached proportions that Japanese planners had considered impossible. Colonel Ammer Sims's 182nd Infantry Regiment had brought heavy artillery and mechanized equipment that transformed the tactical balance on the island. The jungle paths that had favored Japanese defensive tactics now worked against them, as American forces used superior firepower to clear vegetation and create new avenues of advance. Captain Jefferson de Blanc's Marine Fighter Squadron had achieved air superiority over the Solomons, shooting down Japanese aircraft faster than they could be replaced. The myth of Japanese pilot superiority had been shattered by American training methods that emphasized teamwork over individual heroics. The Wildcat and newly rived Corsair fighters proved more than a match for the famous Zero, particularly when flown by pilots who understood their aircraft's strengths and limitations. The strategic situation had shifted dramatically in favor of the Allies. According to naval intelligence reports from the Pacific Fleet Archives, Japanese naval losses during the Guadalcanal campaign had crippled their ability to conduct major offensive operations. The Imperial Navy had lost experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft carriers, while American industrial production was delivering new ships and planes at an unprecedented rate. The Japanese decision to evacuate Guadalcanal came directly from Emperor Hirohito's headquarters, marking the first time in the war that Japanese forces had voluntarily withdrawn from conquered territory. The evacuation plan, codenamed Operation K, required the coordination of remaining naval forces to extract the survivors of the 17th Army under cover of darkness. The irony was not lost on Japanese commanders. The same Tokyo Express runs that had delivered reinforcements would now carry the remnants of their army to safety. Colonel William Jenna's artillery regiment had established observation posts throughout the captured territory, calling down devastating fire on any Japanese forces that attempted to organize resistance. The jungle that had once sheltered Japanese defenders now became a trap, as American forces systematically cleared each valley and ridge line. The sound of artillery fire echoed constantly across the island, punctuated by the crash of falling trees and the explosions of demolition charges. The final Japanese positions round Mount Austin had been fortified with typical thoroughness, but American forces now possessed the firepower and tactical experience to reduce these strong points methodically. Flamethrowers and demolition charges cleared bunkers that had withstood weeks of conventional assault, while Marine engineers sealed caves and tunnels to prevent their reoccupation. The physical transformation of Guadalcanal reflected the broader changes in the Pacific War. Henderson Field had been expanded into a major air base, with multiple runways and permanent facilities that could support large-scale operations. The jungle airstrip that Marines had desperately defended in August had become the foundation for Allied air superiority throughout the Solomon Islands chain. As January 1943 began, the sounds of battle gradually faded from Guadalcanal's jungles. The epic struggle that had consumed both armies for 6 months was entering its final phase. With the outcome no longer in doubt, the Marines and soldiers who had defended Henderson Field had written a new chapter in military history, proving that determined resistance could halt even the most fanatical enemy offensive. The pre-dawn darkness of February 9, 1943, witnessed the final act of the Guadalcanal campaign as the last Japanese destroyers disappeared into the night, carrying with them the survivors of what had once been the proud 17th Army. Colonel Alexander George's patrols moved cautiously through the abandoned Japanese positions, finding only scattered equipment and hastily dug graves that testified to the human cost of the 6-month struggle. The silence that settled over the jungle was profound, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft engines from Henderson Field. The evacuation of Japanese forces had been executed with the skill and precision that characterized their military at its best. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's destroyers had managed to extract nearly 11,000 survivors from the beaches west of Cape Esperance, though these men were shadows of the elite soldiers who had landed months earlier. Disease, malnutrition, and constant combat had reduced the Japanese garrison to a fraction of its original strength, while the survivors carried with them the psychological scars of their first major defeat. Major General Alexander Patch's forces had achieved complete control of Guadalcanal by February 21st, but the price of victory had been enormous. American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed and wounded, while an estimated 25,000 had been evacuated due to disease and combat fatigue. The tropical environment had proven as deadly as enemy action, with malaria and dysentery claiming more victims than Japanese bullets or shells. The strategic implications of the Guadalcanal victory extended far beyond the Solomon Islands. The campaign had demonstrated that American industrial capacity could sustain prolonged operations in the Pacific, while Japanese resources were stretched to the breaking point by the demands of defending a vast empire. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered forever, replaced by the reality of American determination and material superiority. Lieutenant General Millard Harmon's Air Forces had established permanent bases throughout the Solomons, creating a network of airfields that would support the drive toward Rabaul and the Japanese strongholds in the Central Pacific. The crude jungle airstrip that Marines had defended so desperately had become the foundation for Allied air superiority throughout the region. Henderson Field now hosted squadrons of heavy bombers that could reach targets previously considered safe from American attack. The human cost of the campaign was reflected in the condition of the men who had fought it. The Marines of the 1st Division were evacuated to Australia, where many required months of medical treatment before they could return to duty. The jungle warfare that had characterized the Guadalcanal fighting had pushed human endurance to its limits, creating a generation of veterans who carried the physical and psychological scars of their ordeal for the rest of their lives. The Japanese withdrawal from Guadalcanal marked the end of their offensive capability in the Pacific. The losses in ships, aircraft, and experienced personnel could not be replaced. While American production was accelerating to unprecedented levels, the strategic initiative had passed irreversibly to the Allies, who now possessed the bases and experience necessary to carry the war to the Japanese home islands. As referenced in post-war historical analysis, the Guadalcanal campaign represented a turning point comparable to Stalingrad in the European theater. The Japanese military's belief in spiritual superiority over material advantage had been proven fatally flawed, while American forces had demonstrated their ability to adapt to jungle warfare and overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The legacy of Guadalcanal extended beyond military history to encompass the broader transformation of American society. The citizens who had followed the campaign through newspaper reports and radio broadcasts had seen their military forces prove themselves against a previously invincible enemy. The Marines who had held Henderson Field became symbols of American resolve, their sacrifice providing inspiration for the difficult campaigns that lay ahead. The silence that descended over Guadalcanal's jungles in February 1943 was not the silence of defeat, but a victory dearly won. The island that had witnessed such desperate fighting would serve as a stepping stone for the Allied advance toward Japan, while the lessons learned in its steaming jungles would guide American forces through the battles yet to come. The epic struggle for Guadalcanal had ended, but its impact would resonate throughout the remainder of the Pacific War and beyond, standing as testament to the courage and sacrifice of those who had fought to turn the tide of history.